Thank you very much for having me. And I should apologize to start with. My French is very, very bad. So there will be things that I miss and perhaps things that have already been said, and I can only apologize. But today I am going to talk about images like this one, which you've actually already seen some of these. So I know they're not going to be entirely unfamiliar to you, a specialist audience. And indeed, they were really widely produced in the early modern world. Initially in gynecological manuscripts, and later in the new genre of printed vernacular midwifery manuals. So birth figures have a very long history in gynecological manuscripts. The earliest known birth figures were produced to illustrate copies of a Latin translation of Soranus's gynecology by a North African writer of the 5th or 6th century called Musio. They entered print in 1513 in copies of Eucharius Roslin's Des Fangen Frauen und Hebammen of Rosengarten. This work was immediately popular and translated into both Latin and many European vernaculars. The first English edition was published in 1540, and it remained the dominant midwifery text in England until the 17th century. In 1554, another midwifery manual was published in German and Latin editions in Zurich. Jakob Rueff's book contained new birth figures, and both images and text circulated widely. There was only one English edition of Rueff's text, printed in 1637, but his birth figures arrived earlier and had a much stronger impact on English visual culture, as they were reproduced in many other works on midwifery and surgery. So these two sets of birth figures, originating with Roslin and Rueff, heavily influenced the visual culture of pregnancy in Europe throughout the 16th and early 17th centuries. They circulated in many midwifery texts, as well as some surgical texts and fugitive sheets. From the mid-17th century, birth figures diversified as authors moved away from copying these established sets to create images that communicated new kinds of knowledge and practice. The visual form remained crucial to how midwifery knowledge was disseminated, and it is, of course, still part of the epistemology of midwifery today. But today, in this paper, I'm going to focus on these early sets, originating with Roslin and Rueff. But having established their history, we must really dig into what they actually are. Clearly, they are images that show the fetus in the uterus. They always come in sets, because they describe the different ways in which a fetus can present for birth. From the usual head first or cephalic presentation to breech and feet first, to an array of more unusual and dangerous presentations. There is much to say about how these images shaped practice and the professional identity of midwifery in the early modern period, but today I'm going to take another tack and look at the material power of birth figures for maternal viewers. If you want to know more about the history of birth figures and their different agencies, then please do look out for my book, Birth Figures, Early Modern Prints and the Pregnant Body, which will be published with the University of Chicago Press at the end of this year. So before I begin to explore the power of these images in detail, I want to take a minute to just discuss some terminology. Birth figures were produced and reproduced across Europe and beyond, but my particular focus is on England, where the words uterus, matrix, and womb were all regularly used in medical texts. Early modern readers understood the nuances of these terms. Matrix certainly would have had resonances with both mother and with other kinds of matrix used in artisanal practice, which I will speak more about. Uterus is Latinate and was associated more with prestigious medical learning and anatomical knowledge. Womb was probably the most used in vernacular texts. It has Germanic origins and originally meant the entire belly or trunk of a person or animal, before narrowing in its meaning to refer only to the uterus. In this paper, I will use all three words, as all would have been familiar to interested readers in the 16th and 17th centuries. And together they really demonstrate the epistemological diversity of the womb. Also in this talk, I refer to early modern people who were pregnant and gave birth as women and as mothers. In this, I am using the language of the period and indicating that early modern culture strongly associated womanhood with the capacity to engender, birth, and nourish children. Indeed, this association is bodied in the very linguistic focus of this symposium on the matrix. But it would have been a problematic concept for many early modern women who could not or who did not want to conceive, carry, birth, or breastfeed, as well as those who could, but who did not identify as women. While pregnancy and motherhood were dominant concepts in the defining of gender, that does not mean they could control people's lived experience of their gender. However, for many women in the early modern world, pregnancy was an event that loomed large in their understandings of their bodies and their identities. While birth figures are ostensibly images produced for a professional readership of midwives and physicians, I argue that they would have been accessed by and of great interest to lay readers as well. They also had many and various significances outside of the diagrammatic description of fetal presentation. For some viewers, for example, these images could be understood as meditations upon creative faculty, that of God, of the artist, and of the mother. Generation, pregnancy, and birth were matters for religion as much, if not more so, than for medicine. Even medical images like these ones would also have been understood by early modern eyes as manifestations of God's creative power and his divine mystery. The agency of God as creator of the human is made explicit in many prayers from the period, including this one from Thomas Bentley's late 16th century book of Prayers for Women. And as good Lord, thou doest me make thy shop to shape thy work therein. Thy handwork so do not forsake, but end the thing thou doest begin. In this metaphor, the maternal body becomes a workshop and God an artisan. The conceit was not unusual. The body was often envisioned as a building or a house, and the link between the womb and the space of artisanal production was also common. This kind of thinking had wide applications for professional and lay medicine, but it may also have been appealing to women because of its potential to empower. Conceits such as this one in Bentley's book could be understood to make the woman in some degree a partner with God in the making of new life. And certainly the idea of the womb as the workshop of God endows both virtue and value on the work of the mother. Indeed, so important was the power to create life in the early modern period that many male authors borrowed the conceit to legitimize their own intellectual productions. In prefaces and commentaries all over the early modern period, we find authors likening their books to their children and their work in producing them to the labor of the mother in childbirth. Indeed, midwifery authors were not immune from this temptation, creating interesting meta-narratives in the introductions of their midwifery manuals. But writers were not the only people to liken their work to the gestation of children. In alchemical practice, for example, the combining of different materials was often understood as a kind of mystical, chemical, sexual union, and the product of these experiments were children, often hermaphroditic children who symbolized balance between opposing forces. For authors, the link between literary and bodily creation was a conceit, but in other artisanal practices, there was a more fundamental concordance between forms of creation. In alchemy, as Tara Numedal has shown, the link was employed as part of a complex visual symbolic language, but it also said something more fundamental about how creative faculty worked in the world. Anna Maria Zieglerin, a female alchemist of the 16th century, for example, produced an alchemical oil called lion's blood that allowed her to create physically perfect children in the workshop of her own womb. For her, bodily and artisanal creation were not similar, they were interchangeable. Indeed, thinking around conception, particularly the Galenic theory, which proposed that male and female seeds mixed in the uterus to produce the child, was often quite alchemical. This was likely visually expressed for some viewers of birth figures, particularly in those produced after Rosslin, where the uterus is rendered like an upturned glass flask, similar to those used in uroscopy and in alchemy. Visual accordances like this serve to remind us that not all medical images were produced under anatomical systems of representation. Thinking around the body, how it worked, and how it could be treated was much more various. Indeed, the very process of print production itself was linked to thinking around conception and gestation. This can be seen in the multiple meanings of the word matrix. As we know, this word could refer to the uterus or womb, but was also a word used for the molds used to cast type, coins, and medals, as well as the metal plates used for intaglio printing. In both cases, the matrix is an environment in which something is made, impressed, and shaped. This thinking around creation goes back to Aristotelian theories of perception, that the mind was like a wax tablet impressed by sensory experiences. The idea that things, be they ideas, babies, or images, were all created by processes of impression, underpinned the power of the birth figure in the early modern world. For early modern people, the power of print was very much based in its materiality and its inherent links with theories of both creation and impression. Ed Wook has argued, and I quote, "Whereas cultural theorists have paradigmatically ascribed to reproduction the effect of emptying out content and meaning, early modern beholders appear to have maintained the opposite, interpreting the imprint of the intaglio or relief press and the act of dissemination as authorizing processes that imbued the multiple image with transcendent value. The fact that an image could now exist in multiple may have changed modes of viewing and perception, yet far from diminishing the aura of the work by stripping away its authenticity and individuality, the printing press built upon and even enhanced the cultic status of images put to a vast range of uses." We tend to see printed images as less prestigious than unique works and as lacking that, quote, aura of art. On top of this, we often see printed book illustrations as simply technical or informational. We tend to limit and categorize the epistemic image, where early modern people saw an inherently pluralistic kind of power. For them, the print's very reproducibility gave it authority, the medium lent credibility to the information it conveyed. But prints were also evocative, affective objects in ways that feel deeply strange to us today. Sean Roberts, for example, notes that in the first decades of printing, the very newness of the techniques gave them an almost magical status. And long after this, Rebecca Zorach argues that the refined production of line and tone in an engraving could produce the illusion of color and life. She argues that a medium that to us seems fundamentally limited evoked an entire sensorium of tone and movement to an early modern viewer, whose visual and cultural contexts were so different. Finally, the power of the print to impress the mind was well recognized. William McGregor has discussed how early modern prints were understood as things not just looked at, but fundamentally internalized through processes of mental impression. Example of prints ravishing the senses of the viewer, impressing their minds, and shaping their bodies spread across disciplines. Epistemic or informational images were widely understood to be able to teach concepts or information that text could not. In art education, prints were understood to train the eye and the hand through both studying and copying. And the power of the religious print ranged from meditational aid to conduit for divine power. So if we turn again to these birth figures, we can see them in a new light as objects of power, and even more so because they were such ready objects for maternal imagination. In this period, marks and disfigurements, illnesses, and character flaws in the child were routinely attributed to shocks, frights, or strong feelings experienced by the mother during pregnancy. Things the mother saw or experienced could physically shape the unborn child. Early modern midwifery manuals tended to focus on the negative consequences of this bodily power. The potential for women to accidentally disfigure their children through looking at disturbing or shocking things, or not sating their cravings. The booming broadside market was also rife with reports of monsters created by maternal imagination. These are perhaps the most famous examples that we're seeing on the screen, the hairy woman and the black child born to white parents, who were reproduced hundreds of times as illustrations and frontispieces, including in many editions of Aristotle's masterpiece. However, there is evidence that maternal imagination was not just an uncontrollable force to be feared. It could be turned by women to the shaping of healthy, beautiful children. Indeed, Frances Gage has argued that the use of all kinds of images as aids to positive maternal imagination was so widespread and well-known that it was rarely recorded, and so now goes under-recognized by historians. There is also evidence of particular art objects made specifically as focuses for the maternal gaze. Morten Steen Hansen, for example, suggests that a sculpture of the Christ child by Paolo Bernini was made for Queen Maria Theresa because it was important that pregnant women behold noble and agreeable objects, as the sight of these would affect the child positively. Catherine Park and Jacqueline Marie Muscaccio have both pointed to Italian maiolica tableware and painted wooden trays that were produced specifically for pregnant women and often featured putti as focuses for prayer and maternal imagination. By gazing attentively at these objects, Park argues, mothers would literally shape their offspring, raising their chances of producing a well-formed son. But what does all this have to do with birth figures? These are ostensibly technical medical images, and one's arguably not appropriate for vulnerable and impressionable pregnant women because they depict a range of dangerous malpresentations. Well, this is certainly one part of their story, but it's worth remembering that images facilitate the making of all kinds of meaning, depending on who the viewer is and what they need or want from the image. Vernacular midwifery manuals, moreover, were by no means a resource restricted to professional readers. They were often expressly addressed to midwives as well as to medical men, and some authors also framed their works as suitable for collective reading in the birthing chamber or by communities of women. The availability of such texts mean that they were probably widely accessed by lay readers and of particular interest to childbearing women. It's important to remember that in this period, people took very active roles in their own medical treatment, following the advice of a variety of authorities, from family members to quacks and irregulars to university-trained physicians, and debated with or switched between them. Many midwifery manuals explicitly stated that they would give women the knowledge that would allow them to judge the skills of a midwife. If midwifery manuals and their illustrations had all kinds of users, then they must also have had all kinds of uses. There is relatively little direct evidence of the variety of ways in which birth figures were interpreted, but we do have a comment from one 17th century English surgeon and midwife, Percival Willoughby, who described all the schemes and various figures on which midwives look, making their women to think of wonders by showing them these pictures of children and assuring them that by these they be directed and perfected and much enlightened in the way of midwifery. So in some cases, at least, it seems that birth figures were a tool of reassurance as well as one of education used by midwives. They made women think of wonders, a curiously ambiguous phrase, and one likely meant by Willoughby to denigrate the ability of women to think and act rationally. Yet perhaps it also indicates the capacity of such an image to produce wonders. Let's look more closely at these birth figures themselves. Yes, they show malpresentations, but at least in this period, the danger of death and disfigurement is not emphasized. The fetuses seem to roll, tumble, and slide out of the womb. Such images could well have expressed for pregnant viewers a healthy infant, well-nourished and strong enough to fight their way out into the world. Indeed, in this period, it was understood that the fetus contributed to the labor and that a weak fetus was a cause, not an effect, of a long or difficult labor. Such acrobatics as we see here, seen all together, may have been understood as a visual expressions of the rollings and kicks experienced by women later in pregnancy. The fetuses, too, are not scrawny-limbed, wobbly-headed neonates, but chubby, sturdy, mop-headed toddlers. They are putti. Let's compare one birth figure to a desco da parto, an object that we know was produced to aid positive maternal imagination. The styles are remarkably similar. A healthy, chubby, active, obviously male child is framed in a circle. In the desco, this is a fruitful landscape. In birth figures, it is the world of the uterus, commonly understood as a microcosm or an entire miniature world. Within the context of positive maternal imagination practices, birth figures like this one can express the ideal child in their bodily health and activity and their harmony with a fruitful world. The presence of the birth figure in many households and its intimate form held in the hand and revealed in the act of turning pages make it a prime candidate for acts of positive maternal imagination. Indeed, as print of all kinds became more common and accessible, and particularly as people of many confessions became used to acts of meditation or prayer guided by printed imagery, the birth figure's very form might well have invited extended contemplation and readily impressed the mind and the womb of the viewer. So for some viewers, birth figures did not just give information about the hidden world of the bodily interior, they materially shaped that interior. They were imbued with all kinds of power, from the iconography of the puto, to the authority of learned anatomy, to the particular capacity of the printed image to impress the mind. To look on such an image was to imagine a healthy boy child, well past the most dangerous phase of infancy, smiling, playing, prospering, and thus to create that child within oneself. Print in the early modern period is often thought of as a technology that propelled early modern culture towards modernity, particularly when it comes to science and medicine. While much work done along these lines is both valuable and important, the assumption has led to a narrowing of how the medium is understood. Medical illustrations, for instance, are often interrogated for their power to influence abstract learning or material practice, but they are less often thought about as being materially or magically powerful in themselves, as agents that can directly affect the world. Particularly with images that are not explicitly religious or occult, we are neither culturally primed nor academically inclined to see this kind of power. Yet it is something that we must take seriously, both to understand what birth figures did for early modern viewers and to understand the role of the visual in early modern culture. When it comes specifically to birth figures, they have often been used as tools in the telling of a particular story. The story of the takeover of midwifery by men and by medicine. Over the early modern period, in text and in practice, authority was largely transferred from women to an elite male community of medical practitioners, though the actual work of delivering women remained largely in the female realm. Within this narrative, birth figures can be seen as a way for male academic medicine to assume authority over the invisible, wayward, sinister womb, to visualize it and to pin it down. This is certainly part of their story. But the thing is, they were also used by different kinds of people. We know from Willoughby that they were also used by midwives as tools of reassurance, comfort, and explanation. And what of pregnant women themselves? They may have seen the images as part of a masculine medical explanation of their bodies, but given how popular they were for centuries, I suspect they were also put to more positive and productive uses. Indeed, the images allow for many kinds of interpretation, leading to many kinds of power. By understanding birth figures as objects of maternal imagination, we see both another aspect of their power in the early modern world and elucidate the history of people whose outlooks, practices, and bodily experiences are less often considered in histories of medicine and art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for this very beautiful paper, which echoed many things we just heard earlier, and also developed a lot on this metaphorical relationship between the matrix and the idea of creation, even the print, which impresses the mind, and also on this agency of birth images on maternal imagination. So thank you very much for the and now maybe we can go for the second paper today. So again, I'm very glad to introduce Jordan Troeller, with art historian of modern and contemporary art in Europe and in America, and is now a postdoctoral researcher at the Freie Universität of Berlin. Her research addresses the relationship between gender, representation, and historiography. And today she's going to talk about Michelangelo's method, the childbirth metaphor in Italian Renaissance art theory, and maybe you can switch spots in order to change the slide.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here, and I already see that that although you didn't see the papers beforehand, it's remarkably well organized, because not only did the first two papers draw upon each other, but now I'll sort of elaborate some things that Rebecca just touched upon in terms of thinking about how this metaphor shifts. When she spoke about kind of maternal viewership, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens when we have maternal authorship. So to that end, I begin with a work not from the early modern period, but from the late 20th century, a photograph by the Jamaican-born Renee Cox. Cox herself is pictured here in this photograph, posed as the Virgin Mary holding the body of Christ. And as you can all see, the scene is a direct citation of Michelangelo's Pietà, but with a number of important reversals at play. Cox substitutes her own black photographed body in the place of a white marble one. And she enlarges the body of Christ to the full dimensions of a grown man. And instead of a pious, upturned left hand, I'm sure you can all see that, in the Michelangelo, hers grips the heavy knee of the body on her lap. And most importantly, perhaps, is that she introduces another competing representation of motherhood. Cox invokes that archetypal figure of desexualized motherhood for which the Virgin Mary stands, but she also, through her own body, introduces an actual mortal mother, an identity that Cox thematizes in other works very explicitly, in which she poses pregnant or with her own children. To borrow from the queer feminist poet Adrienne Rich, Cox plants this institution of motherhood as a regime of impossible expectations and idealizations with the lived experience of motherhood, an experience as individual and diverse as mothers themselves. So I'm interested in this photograph because I think it returns us in a new way to an old familiar observation in art history. And that observation, made at least since the 1970s in the Anglo-American context, is that analogies to female biological reproduction, including pregnancy, embryonic gestation, childbirth, breastfeeding, and child rearing, have long served as a way of describing and underscoring the power of artistic creation. Such analogies take many forms, from the arts personified as a nude female figure, to the self-staging of the artist as a pregnant woman, to descriptions of the artwork as born instead of made, as was the case with the 6th century Greek sculptor Myron. Such analogies are so pervasive in the arts and literature that the art historian David Summers, in his 1993 essay Form and Gender, argued that this kind of language goes to the very heart of the discipline of art history. Quote, much of the metaphorical language, perhaps the fundamental metaphorical language, in which we discuss artistic invention is biological, and more specifically, sexual and reproductive in character, at the same time that reproduction may be characterized by analogy with art, unquote. Thus the Latin creare, which means produce, to beget, or bear. Art historians use reproductions A patron is a father. Author is from actor, from agere, to increase, to produce or originate, while genius is from genere, to grow, and related to genre, race, people. And all of these terms are indispensable to our disciplinary terminology. And yet there's been little reflection on what this means, especially for those interested in the role of gender and metaphor. And as many art historians have observed, the Italian Renaissance, and Michelangelo's work in particular, serves as a paradigmatic case study for such analogies. With a focus on how they operate in his Pietas, such analogies are unintelligible outside of sex, with sex here meaning, quote, the full sexual cycle, courtship and brooding, fertility, coupling and birth, and beyond birth, a sexual symbolization of parenthood, unquote, according to Leo Steinberg in his essay, The Metaphors of Love and Birth in Michelangelo's Pietas. Although Steinberg's insight was made over 50 years ago, 1970, curiously, few art historians have taken this up and developed it. And yet his insight seems foundational for understanding the role of the so-called childbirth metaphor, a term that I'm using to borrow from the literary feminist scholar Susan Friedman in terms of how we talk about and identify this metaphor. So what I'm going to do in what follows is explore this analogy from three angles. So first I'll look a little bit more at the philosophical origins, returning again to Aristotle, and then I'll look at Michelangelo's use of the term concepto or conception as a way in which we can give us more specific definition of what was specific about this analogy during the Renaissance. And then I'll return to this idea of matrix and draw out some implications of understanding this metaphor when we think about it in the terms of the maternal, rather than sex and femininity in general. So first, the philosophical origins. And what's important to understand here is that treatises on art and are drawing implicitly, if not sometimes explicitly, on Aristotle's theory of causation. And I'm sure everyone in the room knows this much better than I do, but I'll just lay it out to get some important terms on the table, because in this instance, the metaphorical uses of matrix have so much to do with an understanding of agency and causality, which I think is quite different in some other papers, how the metaphor is being used. So Aristotle explains the process of biological creation through four causes. The efficient cause, or the originary impetus, which leads to the making of the thing. The formal cause, which gives form to matter. The material cause, or the matter that receives that form. And the telic cause, or goal that it endeavors to reach. And here it's important to point out that we have this basic binary being drawn between form on the one hand as the active component and matter or matière on the other hand as that which is acted upon. So I just give you this very typical analogy where the efficient cause could here be translated as carpentry, the formal cause as design, forming this raw matter. The material cause as the wood, which is acted upon, and this material cause I'll return to. And finally, the sort of perceived goal of the whole process, a finished table on which one can eat. It was with Aristotle, too, that we have the argument that the making of entirely new things, nature, follows the same ontological pattern as the making of representations of those things, so art. That art and nature, although different in kind, both come into existence through the same pattern of causality. And although Aristotle and Galen have important differences, they agree in this point. As Galen writes, in the same way the sculptor Phidias possessed the faculties of his art before touching the material, so it is with semen, unquote. And then you have this idea carried over directly in the medieval and early modern period, as in Thomas Aquinas' statement. In the arts, the interior art gives disposition to the matter to which the higher art gives form. so also the generative power of the female prepares the matter, which is then shaped by the active power of the male. So it's with these ancient origins of this theory of causality that it already becomes a gendered theory of causality. Form as the active element becomes coded as male, while matter as the passive element becomes coded as female. The material cause is the necessary but least important of the four. Without it, the making of the table or the growth of the embryo cannot take place, but it does not itself generate life. And in this sense, Aristotle differed from other Greek authors who argued for this doctrine of two seeds that Rebecca mentioned, which distributed the principle of agency. But it's with Aristotle's theory, rather than Galen's, as some art historians have argued, which were adapted by medieval scientists and then later by Renaissance thinkers. And in this sense, very little change between the medieval and the early modern periods. But what happens in the Italian Renaissance and what marks it as significantly different from these earlier formations of the analogy is that this analogy's gendered affiliation, that's okay, it'll be dark, is reversed. So that reversal is what I'll turn to next. And so how did this happen? An explanation begins with the second point, with Michelangelo's use of concetto or concept as a concrete instance of the specificity of this analogy for the early modern period. In his 1924 study, Idea, a concept in art theory, Erwin Panofsky was the first to observe that Michelangelo eschewed the more prevalent idea in describing his works and instead called them concetti or concepts. And concetto comes from the Latin concepere, which means to lay hold of entirely, to absorb as liquid, to catch as a fire, hence to conceive as a child. And as David Summers has observed, a concetto is a thing conceived in the mind, and the metaphor may be understood as biological, as if the imagination were a matrix or womb. To extend the metaphor, concetti, considered as the progeny of the mind, occupied a lowly position in contrast to ideas. It was not intellect that conceived Michelangelo's new works of art in potentia, but rather the much lower faculty of imagination or fantasy, matter. Unquote. In this way, Michelangelo placed himself within a lineage indebted to Aristotle instead of one indebted to Plato. So a Neoplatonic metaphysician in the late medieval, early Renaissance period, like Marsilio Ficino, would explain biological generation as the manifestation of forms already in existence, just without a material appearance. And in this sense, the key term is idea, and being innate, such ideas originate in some superior being's purely mental act. Any physical existence follows from these pre-existing forms. By contrast, the Aristotelian would say that matter and sensorial experience is of much greater importance. And Rebecca touched on this with her discussion of perception in Aristotle. It instead serves as one of the four necessary causes to anything coming about. So even if this material cause is a passive one and gendered female, it's nevertheless indispensable according to kind of Aristotelian framework, whereas for a Platonist, this becomes really irrelevant. And what this essentially means is that the Aristotelian view allowed artists in the Renaissance to elevate matter and materials to an unprecedented importance in the generative process, in the creative process. As the literary scholar Robert Bauer writes, in reference to Michelangelo's poetry, the conceit, or concetto in Italian, was considered a kind of mental embryo, a numerically distinct entity first granted existence by one or a series of sense perceptions, and then lodged in the matrix of cerebrum and heart, conceived simultaneously meaning understood and felt, until it had grown to a certain stage of maturity and was finally made autonomous by being released as a work of art. The propagation of ideas and the procreation of children in the Renaissance, therefore, were credited with more than a superficial likeness. Each of these distinctly different acts was deemed indispensable to its counterpart, not only as a means of explaining the other, but as an ontological model and pattern from which the other took its being. And here it's sort of interesting to think, to what extent is this still a metaphor then? Michelangelo then went one step further, and as David Summers has pointed out in this brilliant reading of Michelangelo's use of night in this essay he's written, Form and Gender, as a further complication of this metaphorical conceit, the artist is repeatedly associating himself with this feminized realm. Michelangelo's personified night in the Medici chapel becomes a trope in later portraits of the artist. And he himself writes a suite of poems on the subject of night, one of which can be paraphrased as follows. Quote, "He who made time from nothing, made two of one, giving the high sun to one, to the other the near moon. In that instance, chance, fate, and fortune came to each of us, and I was assigned to the dominion of night, even at birth and in the cradle. And so, imitating my very self, I am as the night, which is all the darker as it grows," unquote. And in this way, night is associated with dreaming and imagination, with the darkness that precedes all life, with matter, just as sculpture in other poems and sonnets of Michelangelo is associated with stone. Night is the matrix of inspiration, Summer argues. Quote, "To collect all of these hints together, if Michelangelo is shown as a potential womb of forms, he is also shown in a way entirely consistent with another millennial view of the feminine as waiting passive. If his imagination is the potential mother, who is the father?" Unquote. And that remains a sort of unanswered question. So what we seem to have here, and this brings me to my third and final point, is a direct association of the early modern artist with motherhood and with the material, maternal realm as the source of artistic creation in the sort of unprecedented elevation of Aristotle's material cause. This reverses the gendered binary in which pre-modern artists were associated with the male active form and thus distinguished from the matter on which they worked. Here instead, with Michelangelo's use of the metaphor, his invocation of mata and matrix, we have an explicit alignment of the artist with the mother. And I think that we have to keep in mind that this maternal association was always there in ancient ideas about generation, but as art history began to recognize it, it becomes collapsed with, and in my view, confused with, the feminine more generally. And I think it would be productive in order to make a distinction really between woman and mother. But the extent to which we could do that in the early modern period is also interesting, that Rebecca began with how much femininity is associated with the maternal role. When Cicero translated Aristotle's word for wood and thus for matter, Heil, into Latin, he uses the word materia, which, like Heil, relates to building materials, but more explicitly introduces the tradition that follows from the Latin mata, or mother. Although it is this affiliation with motherhood that marks a metaphor off from its classical antecedents, it remains to be seen what implications the childbirth metaphor has for our understanding of art history's gendered discourses. Why, for instance, does the metaphor, as Bauer points out, dissipate with the end of the 16th century? Quote, "as the phenomenon called the conceit disappears from aesthetic theory," unquote. How might art history's belated recognition of the childbirth metaphor change our understanding of aesthetic theory's origins? And might contemporary artists like Cox, returning to Michelangelo's staged maternal identity as always an actual mother, shift our understanding of this metaphor as the identity of the author-artist shifts? And so I don't have answers to those questions, but I propose that we approach them by introducing this distinction between what Steinberg calls the full sexual cycle and the more specific language of motherhood. For I suspect that the analogy between art making and biological making hinges on the figure of the mother, rather than simply on woman or the erotic or love or parenthood in general, as other scholars have argued. And that we should look more closely at what happens to this analogy when we do take seriously the specificity of the maternal, of the matrix, as a language in which we describe artistic creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very beautiful presentation. In fact, shift from the focus on the male kind of model to quite interesting.
Questions here? Yeah.
Is Rebecca still available to ask her a question?
Yeah, maybe we could put on.
Rebecca, are you here? Oh, yes. I can see you.
Hello, Rebecca. I have a question for you.
Mm.
Can you hear the question? Yes, yes. Rebecca, can you hear the question or?
No, I didn't hear anything.
Okay, no, but so maybe I can repeat the question.
All right. I would like to ask her about her characterization that by referring to God's creative power, such as the pious reference that she gave to God's creative power, that this was an empowerment of women in the early modern period by equating their procreation to God's power. And what about the inverse possibility of it being likened to godly powers to take away from women their agency and say that they are, or that God is usurping their ability by giving him the credit?
Could you hear the question?
Yes, thank you. I heard that very well. Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think it's totally another way to read it. And the Bentley prayers are so interesting because they give such a mixed sort of outlook on women's religion, because some of the prayers that are printed were written by men and some were written by women, and then they were all like ostensibly for women to use. So you start approaching these texts and like sort of like I was saying with the birth figures in my paper, you start after thinking about how they might have been used by people with different motivations. Because you're totally right, this sort of metaphor of the woman as the workshop could be totally disempowering and even dehumanizing. But I think we sort of have to give early modern women the sort of the credit to work in, you know, sort of like have religion that worked in ways that was productive for them. And you might see it as a sort of subjection, or you might see it as a kind of partnership. And a lot of that is to do with interpretation rather than the words themselves. And there are sort of lots of interesting things about sort of early modern religion and the role of motherhood, and the equation also of, you know, whether women, particularly after the Reformation, were encouraged to associate themselves with sin, or with Christ. And I think often the sort of act of motherhood and childbirth was equated with the sufferings of Christ, which is another way in which, women were able to sort of turn these Christian narratives to ways that empowered the things that were important in their lives.
Maybe you can start, Baptiste, before I speak. Do you have a question? For...
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I had two questions, but maybe there is. I had two questions for Jordan. I wondered whether you found, or in the contemporary philosophy of Michelangelo, some ideas that go to your own conception. Because, for instance, in Ticino, there is the idea of fetus in the mind. The whole metaphorical background of motherly intellectual process, the intellectual process as something that is giving birth to ideas or to reasons very present. So that was my first question. And the second one is going back to Aristotle. There was this idea of the matter isn't just passive. There is this idea, very short passage in the physics, but it's about the matter desiring the form. So there was also in Aristotle, and it was developed upon in medieval, for instance, Albert the Great. So there was this very short but idea of more active dimension of matter, and then mother, because the mother also desires the child, the male, so there was. What did you say? And going back also to the night, Michelangelo.
To what extent does desire play a role? I mean, it brings up this larger question of how do we understand the relationship between, how should I put it, that the relationship between visuality and what is happening in the mind, and the relationship between gestation or physicality. But in a way that maybe, so immediately you reinscribe this typical binary, this mind-body duality, but maybe in some ways there's actually, it's undoing that binary in unexpected ways. So one question might be, what were sort of the theories of visuality at work that allowed sort of this direct connection to be taking place? That would be a question I can't really answer. But one that came to mind, Rebecca, when I was hearing your paper about where you have these instances of well-documented practice of looking and understanding that act of looking as having a direct effect on bodily transformations. And if you wanted to say anything else about, how does it come about that one is so compelled by that? And then to what extent does desire play a role in the materials that you found that would be consistent with these ideas in Aristotle too, that desire plays a role?
I've never thought about it in those terms, really, that this concept of desire isn't one that I've worked with with my material. But I think it's, this notion of impression and the sort of the physical agency of images is sort of all over the early modern world. It's like, I think it's particularly interesting in terms of print because it's a mirroring of the production process. But I think we see it everywhere, and I guess it becomes one of those things that can be conceptualized in lots of different ways.
Florence speaking here. Yes, I think that it's prominent when we come to engraving because of this mise en abîme regarding the matrix used during the process, the artistic process. And it was wonderful to see that you have a testimony of the way the images were used in the 17th century. And I was wondering if maybe those images were linked to a prayer, a text that was supposed to be read in order to lead the women that were looking at those images, those engravings?
So no direct evidence, sadly. My strong feeling is that they may well have been used by women in religious practices and in prayer, just because, the print is so malleable and so portable. And particularly in places like England post-Reformation, when the availability of religious imagery is definitely not gone, but perhaps much less. If having a print of the Christ child would be suspect, but perhaps prayer practices that involve thinking about the Christ child and trying to emulate that sort of bodily perfection within oneself still exist. Something like a birth figure becomes a sort of very deniable and yet very useful sort of tool. I think a lot of this history of these sort of, quote unquote popular images, you sort of have to work from context and what seems possible and likely. But I think there's strong overlaps with prayer practices, definitely.
Thank you. I also have a question for Rebecca. You spoke of how the careful choice of visual imagery could propel the pregnant women to control the aftermath of their pregnancy, their babies, and I would like to, in a sort of wishful thinking, and I would like to ask you how does the power balance work in that case when we have other factors like God's will and nature's accidents or just like life? I'd like to ask you how the women of that time, would they see that as their own failure because like their imagination was not enough, or how would they interpret it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the people who've dealt with it really in a thorough and very sensitive way are Catherine Parker and Lorraine Daston in their big book on wonder. They write a lot about monsters in the early modern world, which really engages in this because, lots of the narratives around monstrosity and the occurrence of monsters was to do with the birth of children with malformations. The narratives around this seem to be around divine portents or warnings or punishments, and in natural philosophy around the sort of physical processes that might create such a child, and in magical narratives and narratives around sort of like the agency of Satan, and then in maternal imagination, which is seen as like a sort of semi-magical but also very sort of physical, sort of natural part of a woman's capacity to generate. And what Daston and Park say about this is that you can't linearize it. Like you can't say that, one was, that first the narrative around divine agency was dominant and then it was superseded by a sort of natural philosophical approach. They actually coexisted, and many of the same births were thought about in multiple ways. And I think that's certainly true also for normal pregnancy, in that a woman could, hold in her mind at the same time the idea that God had the ultimate power over what would happen in her pregnancy, but that also she did have a power within her own body and her ability to impress through maternal imagination. And it's almost like a double think in that, all of these things have power together, even though some seem to propose that they are an ultimate power.
Thank you very much for your answer.
I have a quick question. It's Jordan again, about the if our representations of birth figures, if you found that the iconography changes substantially when midwifery becomes more medicalized and a dominion of the institution of medicine and doctors, if we also see then changes on the level of like how these representations are, sort of representational conventions.
Yes, definitely. There's lots of change. My sort of research goes from the period of focus of this conference, sort of the Renaissance, up until sort of the turn of the modern era. And the images become much more technical from the late 17th century, much more anatomical, and much more various. Like for a long time, it's really just these two sets that are circulating in print, the ones that I talked about today. And then from the late 17th century, all these different authors begin producing their own, and they begin differentiating them in lots of different ways. And I think an interesting thing that happens is that while there becomes this much more elite medical visual culture birth figures, which have these, much more sort of difficult to read visual elements, or visual elements that are only readable to the medically trained. But at the same time, what we might call traditional birth figures, or the ones I looked at today, remain available and in print and in reprints of popular medical books, literally until like the 1940s. And Mary Fussell at the moment is writing an amazing book on Aristotle's masterpiece and the like really longue durée of popular medical texts. So the sort of the multiple agencies of these images, I think, really has a very, very long history, even after the quote unquote medical takeover of midwifery.
Is there any other question? Or well, I have another one, just a last question for you, Jordan. It's about, because you talked about the artistical process. But in the case of Michelangelo, it's just sculpting and above all marble sculpting. And Michelangelo himself says that it's about subtracting, taking away, not adding something. And maybe this can also go for a metaphor, I don't know, not like a paternal metaphorical to add the cement, the matter, but rather to extract something.
Yeah, I mean, carving itself as a sculptural technique takes on a precedent unseen in, since in the Western imagination, for sure. And my sense is that it is really bound up with that the Renaissance is the Renaissance because matter and materials come to the fore in a way that they haven't ever before. And the question is then, to what extent does the childbirth metaphor play a role in enabling that? That maybe that is a discursive conceit that plays a huge role actually in legitimizing matter as a viable kind of source for the act of artistic making. And that's something that I don't think we've really explored. But as far as from my perspective, but it would be interesting to see, because I think some of the gender biases they set up a real challenge to going down that road. Instead, we end up making those arguments in terms of form, that this is a new emphasis on form. But yeah, that's a bigger problem.
Other question?
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. But I was thinking as you were speaking about sort of examples I've found of this sort of maternal or gestational metaphor. And my research is really partial, but I feel like there's often a struggle between this sort of ideal of production and the fact that there were also loads of narratives around generation that were about the corrupting or the unhealthy aspects of the female body and the sinister ability of the mother to like malform or damage the child. And I wondered whether this is something that any of your sources sort of deal with, or like how they get around these sort of sinister aspects of maternity.
I guess I'm primarily interested in the way it could be read against the grain as a unexpected metaphor for agency, because I see a lot of those metaphors as sort of misogynist versions of the metaphor, and more expected, and less expected is to, where you have somebody like Henry James literally writing that you know, he is pregnant, you know, trying to find a place on the bus as he's moving through the city. I mean, it's so strange, some of how the way that the male artist is staging himself as not only a woman, but a pregnant woman, in this way that is not read as a kind of a queering at all, but really a way to underscore the power of art. And I would like to understand the operations and motivations of that metaphor better. And I guess, and I feel like those that stress the sort of corrupting powers are more expected and sort of less interesting somehow. But that's not. I could imagine a counter argument to that view.
If there is not any question anymore, maybe we can again thank the two presenters of this morning. So thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and maybe we can go to the break now. Une petite pause. La pause déjeuner, on reprend à 14h30. Ouais. Très bien. Merci beaucoup.